call now on the member for Bordentown West to grace us with prayers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech Thee so to direct and prosper the deliberation of the Legislative Assembly now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundation for the glory of Thy name and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all those who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established amongst us. Especially we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of Cabinet, ex-officio members, members of the Legislative Assembly, the Chief Justice, and members of the Judiciary, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for Thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be Thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make His face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up His light of His countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. This Honorable Legislative Assembly has resumed its sitting.
Administration of oaths or affirmations.
None.
Reading by the Honorable Speaker, messages and announcements.
I have two apologies. The Honorable Minister of Education, whose flight from Cayman is not arriving until about 12:30 today, and the Honorable Minister of Financial Services cannot be here this morning as she has a matter with her son at the hospital from last night, and I do hope that things are improving for her and the boy. Good to see the senior member, one of the senior members of the House, Mr. Eden, back today.
Presentation of petitions.
None.
Presentation of papers and of reports.
None.
Questions to the Honorable Ministers and members of the Cabinet.
The first question, number 8, goes, the two questions, I guess, 8 and 9, goes to the member responsible, the Minister of Health, who has not yet arrived. And so can we agree to allow the questions once he arrives at that point? All in favor? Those against that?
Mr. Speaker, I just want to rise on a matter of procedure. As I'm developing my skills as a legislator, I just want to know that the proper protocol. Isn't it we supposed to move a motion to have it deferred?
Well, I thought that's what I just did. Although it's not a written formal motion, I said all those. Why? Questions, let me put it again. Questions 8 and 9, the minister responsible for answering, the Honorable Minister of Health, is not yet arrived. Therefore, I would like to put down the questions when he comes in. All those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. When the minister comes, he will answer the questions at that point.
Statements by honorable ministers and members of the cabinet.
None.
Personal explanations.
None.
Obituary and other ceremonial speeches.
None.
Raising of matter of privileges.
None.
Government business. Bills. Second readings. The Defense Bill 2020.
The who's Premier? You taking the bill? The Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill shortly entitled the Defense Bill 2020.
The bill has been duly moved. Is the Premier ready for the introduction?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my voice is not back to full strength, still a little fragile, but I believe it's better than it was on Friday. And providing I don't
I noticed, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Premier, that your voice is, you're saying better, but it's still not good. Do you want to put this bill further down, or you prefer to take it at this time?
I'll take it at this time, sir. We shall carry on until the old voice fails. Or we through. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed an honor to have moved the Defense Bill 2020, which, Mr. Speaker, will provide the statutory underpinning for the Cayman Islands Regiment. Mr. Speaker, the bill provides for the governance and management of the newly established regiment, which is a reserve force whose duties include the defense of these islands, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Cayman Islands Coast Guard when called upon, as well as participating during ceremonial occasions. Mr. Speaker, the motto of the regiment in English is prepared in adversity and speaks to its purpose. Members of the regiment will receive or are receiving, in some cases, the necessary ongoing training so as to be ready to assist during any crisis, whether that crisis is a major fire, an earthquake, a hurricane, a pandemic, or perhaps assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service or the Coast Guard as necessary. Mr. Speaker, a few short months ago, the RCIPS and other uniformed services were stretched beyond measure when we were in the early days of beating back the virus from taking hold in this community. What a difference a fully trained regiment would have been to the men and women of our uniformed service during those days. Mr. Speaker, as far as the pandemic is concerned, we are certainly in a good place in these islands, but far from out of the woods. All around us, the virus is raging. Countries much bigger and with much more resources than we have are being forced back into lockdowns. My point is, Mr. Speaker, we are not out of the woods yet, and we may well need, God forbid, the services of these men and women who have enlisted in the Cayman Islands Regiment. These are still exceptionally challenging times, not only with the pandemic, but every year for 6 months we face storm systems that are increasing with the changing climate. Mr. Speaker, I did this morning, as I do every morning, watch the Weather Channel, go to Cayman Weather, and there is certainly one system there that should cause us all real concern. And we need to watch that very carefully. Pray God it goes the way of the last one. I don't mean that in saying I'm insensitive to it impacting other countries and people, but in the sense of avoiding causing us damage and injury. Mr. Speaker, we now have 25 named storm systems, and it is expected by the end of this week we'll have another one. And the season is not yet over. This trend is going to continue to get worse before it gets better as the planet continues to heat up. The men and women who make up the regiment will play an extremely important role in the security of these islands in the years and decades to come. Mr. Speaker, as individuals and families, as neighborhoods, businesses, as a country, we have long understood and valued the importance of national resilience. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and resulting challenges has certainly reminded us of how quickly any unplanned disaster can have a direct impact on our lives and livelihoods. I do not know how well one can prepare for a pandemic, but certainly the work we have done over the years preparing for hurricanes proved very helpful. Most notably, it is in large part due to the country's steady forward march over the years in pursuit of ever more resilience that we were able to not have been entirely broken by this disaster that is COVID-19. For generations, these islands and our people and businesses have been steadily advancing and modernizing our framework of national resilience. We have achieved this through an evolving catalog of policies, structures, resources, and strategic partnerships with the private sector, civil society, and with the help of other governments, including the UK. Mr. Speaker, collectively we have made great strides in our efforts to increase the likelihood that this country can adequately mitigate, manage, prepare for, and recover from catastrophic and disastrous events. The Cayman Islands Regiment is one more important part of our national resiliency infrastructure, but I believe that they will become an increasingly important part. This embrace of national preparedness, Mr. Speaker, is very much ingrained in us now as it was in our forefathers. From earliest times, we have taken purposeful and strategic steps to build local capacity and capability to prepare for and manage risks that may threaten public safety, security, social well-being, and economic prosperity. Mr. Speaker, looking back, we can proudly point to key milestones and pioneers along this journey of building resilience. Milestones such as the establishment of a company of the Jamaica Home Guard in Grand Cayman in 1942, and the 41 Caymanians who served as full-time soldiers conducting coastal patrols in defense of these islands until 1945. Mr. Speaker, among those soldiers, of course, was Major Joseph Rodriguez Watler, better known to everyone as Mr. Roddy, who was appointed as officer in charge of the company. In my own family, I can count my uncles, Norman Rudolph, McLaughlin and Carlisle, Bert McLaughlin, now both of blessed memory, as members of the Home Guard. My uncle Rudolph also served in what was colloquially called the Trinidad Navy for a number of years. Mr. Speaker, many other Caymanians also served with Allied forces during the Second World War. In fact, history will show that the Cayman Islands contributed the highest number of servicemen per capita, amounting to 2/3 of the adult male population. Since then, Caymanians have continued to serve in defense forces in the United Kingdom and the United States, including many who served in the Merchant Navy. Indeed, many Caymanians have admirably and courageously participated in security conflicts, disaster recovery missions, and humanitarian relief efforts, proudly contributing to the resilience of those countries in their own right. Mr. Speaker, regrettably, the Home Guard was disbanded many years ago, many decades ago. And I often wonder what opportunities we may have lost with that disbanding. But we are now making up for that by taking up the opportunity today to put in place a modern regiment and a modern defense law to guide its operation. The Cayman Islands Regiment, Mr. Speaker, will not only ably assist those in these islands in times of need, but also our regional neighbors and fellow British overseas territories. We have done this in the past, Mr. Speaker. In September 2017, we were able to assist Anguilla with needed security and humanitarian assistance after Hurricane Irma devastated that island, along with the British Virgin Islands and Turks and Caicos. 4 Royal Cayman Islands Police Service helicopter crews were dispatched to Turks and Caicos as one of the first foreign aid contingents to reach those islands, and was the only outside visible presence for 36 hours. The helicopter crew provided the only means of communication between the different islands in the TCI chain. Indeed, the crews flew to every one of the islands in the archipelago with 44 flights and 26 hours in the air, assisting with checks, evacuations, and providing needed provisions and equipment. Also in September 2017, we sent a delegation of 16 members of the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service to British Virgin Islands after their prison was damaged by Hurricane Irma. They were armed and assisted with the control of prisoners, as well as helping to recapture 70 prisoners that had escaped, and they stayed until the prison was secure. They worked alongside BVI police as well as British officers. I remember thinking then how much more assistance we could have provided if we had our own regiment in place at that time, a regiment I have been championing since 2005 after our own lashing from Hurricane Ivan in 2004. As you will recall, Mr. Speaker, the devastation here was incredibly widespread in the aftermath of Hurricane Ivan, creating exceptional vulnerabilities at a national level. In this regard, Cayman will always remember the contributions made by the Royal Bermuda Regiment. 36 volunteer reservists worked alongside the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Cayman Islands Fire Service in that time of crisis and vulnerability. Those reservists provided a surge of resources and expertise that supported efforts to widen roads narrowed by sand, clear areas in and around critical infrastructure, including schools, churches, hospitals, and airports, and distributed much-needed aid and resources to communities. Those reservists were disciplined, compassionate, and supportive in much the same way I know our own reservists will serve this country and its people. The Bermuda Regiment truly opened my eyes to the value of a regiment working alongside our Sorry about that, Mr. Speaker. The Bermuda Regiment truly opened my eyes to the value of a regiment working alongside our communities and neighborhoods, assisting a desperate population with cleanup and recovery efforts. Mr. Speaker, in those days, in those terrible days, in the aftermath of Hurricane Ivan, the Honorable Kurt Tibbetts and myself, who were two of the Georgetown representatives, assumed a significant amount of responsibility for looking after the constituency, distributing food and water and various supplies. And we essentially took over what was then the George Hicks High School's hall as a place to store the supplies and to package them with the assistance of many, many teachers to put them on the trucks to go and distribute. And the Bermuda Regiment was also stationed there. And so we had the opportunity to have lots of discussions with them about the role, how long the regiment had been around, and the kind of training that they did. And of course, Kurt being Kurt and me being me, we couldn't avoid not cooking for them some of those good Cayman delicacies. Salt beef and ocean turbot run down, some salt beef and beans and that sort of stuff that he could cook all in one pot, because there were quite a few of them, about 3 dozen of them. So, Mr. Speaker, we got to understand much more about how the regiment had assisted Bermuda and the region over many, many years. And that, Mr. Speaker, lit a fire in me about the need to try to have one established here. When we won the government for the first time in 2005, the Progressives, that was one of the things that we pursued with the then governor. But at that time, the UK government was not at all inclined to support the establishment of such a regiment, and the idea died on the vine. And so, Mr. Speaker, when the opportunity presented itself again here, when we had a new governor and a supportive UK government with whom I knew I had forged certain relationships, because this is my second term as Premier, I raised the idea again, and the UK were, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, more than happy to push for it. In fact, the minister at the time for the
member for Georgetown Central, are you rising on a point of order? Procedure. We'll try the next one. The next one right by you, that not working? Hansard. My mic is still working. No, I think I can carry.
They don't know. Straighten up.
Can members try their mics still put on?
Testing.
Testing.
It seems
Test.
the Minister of Finance had one working. One is working. Premier, can you try yours?
Test 1, 2.
Yep, working now.
Testing.
Premier, can you check your mic?
Working now, sir. So, Mr. Speaker, I am in the hands of the House. Do they wish me to start all over again?
No. Speak a little louder, though.
I can't speak any louder. I don't have any more voice than this. I'm sorry? No.
I will do that.
I know I tried that.
Premier,
last day.
before you continue, we need to check
Okay.
to see that the Hansards are and the
Okay.
it's being recorded.
Right, so we'll know then where I left off, or where we lost. Yeah, no problem.
And perhaps, Premier, if you could speak directly into the mic, get closer to it, it might be a little bit louder. When things go wrong, nobody won't claim ownership. The only one is working well. While we're waiting to check, just to inform the House that in the gallery this morning are members of the Cayman Regiment. We are very pleased to have them observing proceedings this morning. Honorable members, I would crave your indulgence to have a few words with the Premier. Thank you, honorable members. I'd call on the honorable Premier to continue his introduction of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now it seems like it's always like this when you have one particular handicap. Fate gives you another one. Right? So my voice is challenged, and now the mic system not working properly. I apologize to members and to the broader public, but the recording system is picking up everything I say, so it will be in the Hansards. But, Mr. Speaker, I was ad-libbing here, so I will do my best to repeat it for the benefit of those who didn't hear. I was saying that in the aftermath of Hurricane Ivan, when we took office for the first time, the Progressives, or the PPM as we called ourselves then, took office for the first time in 2005, I really pressed for us to be allowed to follow the example of Bermuda and establish a regiment. But the UK government at the time was not at all inclined to do so, and so the idea died on the vine. But I was delighted when I raised the issue with the current governor to find him being very supportive of the idea, and indeed to find out that the UK government itself was also looking at this particular idea, because as time has worn on and as hurricanes and other natural disasters become more and more common, it seems the UK has come to understand the huge advantage of having an established service, I'm trying to avoid using the word force, but I can't think of another one, an established force in the various territories comprised of people who live there and who have intimate knowledge of the terrain and of the issues that affect the particular territory. And they seized on the opportunity of doing so first in Cayman. Mr. Speaker, it's incredible sometimes how events conspire. And the old saying that it's an ill wind that blows no one any good could not be more true in this particular case. Because were it not for COVID-19, the pandemic, and the fact that because of it, a lot of the activities which would otherwise have taken place, ordinary activities by the UK armed forces and their administration, it is unlikely in the extreme that we would have reached this point so quickly, where we were able to have a contingent come from the UK to train members of the regiment, and also to be able to dispatch a number of our own to the finest military school in the world, Sandhurst, to get officer training. And so, Mr. Speaker, we as a government, and obviously under the leadership and with the support of the governor, decided to strike while the iron is or was hot. And thus, Mr. Speaker, we were able to establish the regiment, have the passing out ceremony a couple of months ago. And now today, Mr. Speaker, we are introducing the bill which will provide the statutory underpinning and set out the rules, regulations, and means by which the regiment will be permitted to operate. Mr. Speaker, I've heard some criticism on some of the talk shows, in fact, charges that the regiment is illegal. Mr. Speaker, that has been, I know, a matter that has truly affected the many of the members of the regiment. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the charges are completely without basis. I don't hear anyone claiming that the Coast Guard is illegal. We've had that up and running now for almost 2 years. We're still working on the legislation that will underpin the Coast Guard. Mr. Speaker, this is something I believe the regiment that we should all embrace, something that we should all be incredibly proud of. I know firsthand that the men and women who have volunteered, because it is a volunteer regiment, there is no conscription, there is no drafting, to use the US expression. The men and women who have joined and the many who have indicated their willingness to join the regiment are incredibly proud to be able to serve this country in this way. Mr. Speaker, the Bermuda Regiment has been in force for at least 55 years. Now it is our time. Not only will it be good for the country, but having a trained and disciplined force in Cayman will have a positive impact on youth development and leadership in our islands. This new regiment, along with increased resilience of our air operations and the great work done by our hazard management team to prepare and coordinate disasters, will help us meet the needs of our islands today and into the future. As we learned, Mr. Speaker, while a regiment may retain skills necessary to deliver an internal security remit, in actuality, circumstances of risk are such that in practice, the main role centers on disaster management, humanitarian aid, and emergency disaster relief. As we saw firsthand from the Bermuda Regiment when they were here in 2004, a trained and equipped regiment provides critical surge capacity, which is especially key as a component of any national disaster preparedness and response mechanism. More recently, Mr. Speaker, it was only back in January of this year that we were all rocked by a 7.7 magnitude earthquake. For many of us, the event itself was a deeply nerve-wracking combination of panic, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. On reflection, it was also a stark reminder of the very real risks we face in respect of such so-called no-notice disasters that will potentially demand supplemental resources should such events lead to wide-scale infrastructure damage or building collapses. An interesting fact, Mr. Speaker, is that in 2018, a representative of the Bermuda Regiment participated in London with the UK's military, security, and health services in an exercise based on a pandemic outbreak. That experience, I'm sure, was very useful when in 2020, they, like us, faced COVID-19. That is the level of training and experience that is available to our regiment. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of this bill, the Defense Bill 2020, is to formally establish the Cayman Islands Regiment and set out the mechanisms by which the regiment is administered. Part 1 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, the preliminaries are addressed in clauses 1 through 8. Clauses 1 and 2 speak to the titles and interpretations. Clause 3 provides for the regiment to be required to perform military services, including training and non-combatant services, both in and outside the Cayman Islands, at the discretion of the governor. Clause 4 provides for the continuation of the regiment as a reserve force. Clause 5 sets out the duties of the regiment. The regiment will be responsible, A, for the defense of the islands, B, for providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, C, assisting the police force, Royal Cayman Islands Police Force, for police service, and the Coast Guard when called upon to do so by the governor, and D, such other duties as the governor determines. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, this enlistment is entirely voluntary. There is no question of there being conscription or in U.S. speak drafting of persons into the regiment. Clause 7 provides for the exercise of the governor's powers and duties under this legislation and any other enactment relating to matters of defense, including armed forces. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the exercise of these powers, the governor shall act in his or her discretion. And Mr. Speaker, just to make it plain, this is entirely in keeping with the governor's constitutional powers, including those in Section 55, which are known as the special responsibilities of the governor. The governor has exclusive responsibility for defense. Clause 8 provides for the delegation of the governor's functions under the legislation to the deputy governor and for the delegation of functions relating to the operations of the regiment to any minister after consultation with the premier. So, Mr. Speaker, the governor can, in appropriate cases, delegate various functions relating to the operations of the regiment to a minister after consultation with the premier. Part 2 of the bill, clauses 9 and 10, deal with the establishment of the Defense Board and the Defense Medical Officer. Part 3 of the bill, clauses 12 through 14, deal with the recruitment, organization, government, training, pay, allowances, and discharge from the regiment. Clause 12 provides for the appointment of the commanding officer. Clause 13 provides that the governor may make or revoke general or special orders to be called governor's orders with respect to the administration, recruitment, organization, government, training, pay, and allowances of the regiment, and with respect to any matter and thing related to the regiment, including promotion and dismissal of members. Clause 14 provides for enlistment and periods of service. Mr. Speaker, the bill provides for persons who are Caymanian or permanent resident or who are Commonwealth or Irish citizens or British Overseas Territory citizens or British citizens. The enlistment period is set out as a minimum of 2 years for soldiers and 3 years for an officer. Clause 14 also provides that the governor may consult the premier and may, in the governor's discretion, allow persons not meeting the stated requirements to be allowed to enlist with the regiment if the governor considers this to be in the best interests of the regiment. Part 4 of the bill, clauses 15 to 17, provide for the governor to appoint by commission persons to the officer ranks and for the relinquishment of commissions. Part 5 of the bill, clauses 18 and 19, set out the exemptions that are applicable to members of the regiment and their primary employers, as well as exemptions from jury duty. Part 6 of the bill, clauses 20 through 24, deal with the obligations to participate in military training, the power to dispense with military training, and the commanding officer's authority to defer or excuse military training. To defer, not differ, to defer. This part also makes it a military offense to fail to complete military training. Part 7 of the bill, clauses 26 and 27, deal with discharge after completing the minimum time in service, discharge as a result of being medically unfit to continue to serve, to be discharged from the Cayman Islands Regiment in order to enlist with Her Majesty's Armed Forces, or discharged through suspension or termination. Part 8 of the bill, clauses 28 through 31, provides for embodiment of the Cayman Islands Regiment. Clause 28 provides for the embodiment of the regiment in the interest of public safety, for the defense of the Cayman Islands, to assist with public safety in another British overseas territory or foreign state, or for any other reason as the governor sees fit. The governor may, by order published in the Gazette or such other manner that may be best suited to the circumstances, direct that the regiment or any part of the regiment be embodied. Clause 29, Mr. Speaker, provides for members of the Cayman Islands Regiment to be subject to the UK Armed Forces Act when a member of the Cayman Islands Regiment is undertaking any duty or training with the UK Reserve or Regular Forces as defined by Section 374 of the UK Armed Forces Act. Mr. Speaker, this makes it clear that the Cayman Islands Regiment is not a part of Her Majesty's military forces. The Cayman Islands Regiment is not a part of Her Majesty's military forces. Mr. Speaker, the following excerpt from Section 347 of the British Armed Forces Act reads as follows. The regular army means any of Her Majesty's military forces other than the Army Reserve, the Territorial Army, and forces raised under the law of a British overseas territory. So, Mr. Speaker, I've heard this particular line being hammered over and over again on on some of the talk shows. It is, what has been said is a complete and utter untruth. The Cayman Islands Regiment is not a part of Her Majesty's military forces, even if we wanted it to be. Section 347 of the British Armed Forces Act prevents it from being so. Section 347 reads, the regular army means any of Her Majesty's military forces other than the Army Reserve, the Territorial Army, or forces raised under the law of a British overseas territory. It couldn't be clearer. Clause 31 sets out the period for the embodiment of the Cayman Islands Regiment. Part 9 of the bill, Mr. Speaker, and more specifically clauses 31 through 51, provide for the discipline, charge, trial and punishment of military offenses. Clauses 31 through 33 provide for the investigation of military offenses, arrests, and for charges heard by the commanding officer or another appointed officer. Clause 34 provides for referral of civil offenses to the Commissioner of Police. Clauses 35 through 37 provide the commanding officer with the power to charge a member of the regiment or refer a matter to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Clause 38 provides for an accused to elect to have the charge, that is a military charge, tried by the summary court. Clause 39 speaks to the powers of the Director of Public Prosecutions under this law. Clauses 40 through 44 provides for penalties, restitution, and appeals. Clause 45 deals with persons who give false statements. Clause 46 provides for mechanisms to deal with offenses committed outside the islands. Clause 47 provides for dealing with civil offenses. And Mr. Speaker, it begs to clarify that for the purposes of this bill, a civil offense means any act or omission punishable by the law of the islands, which, if committed in the islands, will be punishable by that law. Clauses 48 provides for the conviction of certain military offenses to not be deemed to be criminal offenses. Clause 49 provides a saving provision that nothing in sections 40, 41, or 42 shall affect any liability to which a member of the regiment may be subject under Section 29 of the Armed Forces Act. Section 29 of the Armed Forces Act provides that a person subject to service law or a civilian subject to service discipline commits an offense if he escapes from lawful custody. 2, a person subject to service law or a civilian subject to service discipline commits an offense if A, he uses violence against a person in whose lawful custody he is, or his behavior towards such a person is threatening, and B, he knows or has reasonable cause to believe that the custody is lawful. 3, subsection 3, for the purposes of this section, A, references to custody are to service custody. B, a person's behavior includes anything said by him. C, threatening behavior is not limited to behavior that threatens violence. And subsection 4, a person guilty of an offense under this section is liable to any punishment mentioned in the table in section 164, but any sentence of imprisonment imposed in respect of the offense must not exceed 2 years. Clause 50 provides for the trial of offenses. Clause 51 provides for persons who may bring and conduct criminal proceedings. And Mr. Speaker, this brings me finally to Part 10, General. This part encompasses clauses 52 through 63, which provides for a service pension if a member of the regiment is killed or disabled, attendance, pay and discipline, the duty of employers, equipment to be returned and discharged, notices, service of notices, immunity, and the vesting of property. Mr. Speaker, Schedule 1 sets out the officer ranks in the regiment pursuant to Clause 15, while Schedule 3 sets out military offenses pursuant to Clause 2 and 32. Mr. Speaker, although you have done so, I want to acknowledge the members of the regiment who are here with us this morning on this historic occasion as we introduce and debate the Defense Bill 2020. The first appointees to the regiment are Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel Simon Watson, Operations Advisor Lieutenant Colonel Simon Spears, Legal Advisor Major Andre Mondesir, Junior Officer Lieutenant Theo Kelly, Junior Officer Lieutenant Gabe Rabis, Junior Officer Lieutenant Shanice Kelly, Junior Officer Lieutenant Jonassis Swaby, Junior Officer Lieutenant Halston Farley, And Junior Officer Cadet Nathan Dack is currently at Sandhurst. Junior Officer Cadet Tyler Lawson, also currently at Sandhurst. And Regimental Sergeant Major David Shelton. Mr. Speaker, I want to close by saying it is in challenging times that we must continue to strive to establish and fine-tune the structures, resources, policies, and partnerships necessary for us to advance the resilience of our country. On this occasion, the introduction of the Defense Bill 2020 represents another significant milestone in this journey. And so, Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House and pray for its soon passage.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The member from North Side.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a contribution to the debate on the Defense Bill 2020. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I cannot offer my support to the bill before the House because of my concerns with its present form and construct. The reason for not supporting the bill in its present form is because the regiment, in my view, that this bill establishes is substantially and materially different from what was promised and told to the general public about what the roles and purpose of this regiment would be. Now, Mr. Speaker, I support the establishment of a regiment as was outlined in the various press releases done by the Government of National Unity through the Premier and His Excellency the Governor when this was announced in October 2019. But my concerns lie in the fact that much has been added to the role of this regiment that I do not support. Mr. Speaker, I took the time to look at the various media releases made by the parties just mentioned. And nowhere in those press statements was the two roles that concerns me as represented in the law muted. And I listened carefully to the presentation by the Premier this morning. And I support the roles that he detailed for this regiment. That is, that it would be concerned with providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and Coast Guard when called upon so to do by the Governor, What I do not support is the assignment of the role of defense of these islands. And the third caveat in the bill, which says such other duties as the governor may determine. Now, Mr. Speaker, none of the press releases prior to me receiving this bill mention defense, mention a regiment that was going to be armed, mention a regiment that was going to be trained in military procedure, as the Premier said, one of the best military institutions in the world. What it dealt with was that this regiment would be concerned with disaster relief, humanitarian aspects, and assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Force and the Coast Guard in times of need. I can find no reference in any of the press statements that this regiment was going to be dressed in military fatigues, that this regiment was going to be armed. Rumor on the street has it, I haven't found this in any of the press releases, that a shipment of arms has arrived from the UK for this regiment. I don't know whether that is true or not. I hope it is false, because if that is true, Caymanians need to be informed as to what was included in that shipment of arms for this regiment. We have quotations in the press by His Excellency, Mr. Roper. We are not creating an army here. In my view, if you're going to be dressed in military fatigues and you have an armory that you have access to, that's an army. If you are going to defend the islands, you must be an army. The Premier, in press statements as well, said that we were not establishing a branch of the UK military in any way. And while legally, as he has quoted from the bill, that may be true, the mere fact that, as I said, they're being trained in the UK in a military institution, they are dressed in fatigues, tells me that they're an army. Because, Mr. Speaker, I have seen nowhere in any of the press statements that they are getting any training in disaster relief or humanitarian acts. And when you go on their website for the military institution that they have been trained at, there is I could find no reference to any training available for humanitarian and disaster relief. Yet that we all know that much closer to us in Florida, there are many disaster and relief courses available through FEMA and such international organizations, which I would have hoped, and I would support this regiment receiving those kinds of training, because that, I believe, is what is most important if you're going to do disaster relief. Now, I must say, Mr. Speaker, that again, my disappointment lies in the fact that there is so little in the media about this regiment. Nobody has had any consultation with Caymanians to ask them what kind of a regiment would they want to see. If you look at the construct of the legal provisions for the Bermuda Regiment, which is what we were hoping to model, I believe there is substantial difference between what this bill proposes and what the legislation in Bermuda has. I would have preferred that there was some consultation with Caymanians as to what roles we saw this regiment to be. Mr. Speaker, I have had discussions with several Caymanians, including my normal public meeting prior to a meeting of this assembly, to discuss with the constituents that I represent the bills that are coming before the House. I have found no support for this regiment being responsible for defense and for this regiment to be an army, or for this regiment to be under the caveat of anything else the governor may ask them to do. And the members who join this are voluntary, and if they are volunteering to be assistants in disaster relief and humanitarian efforts, and to assist the police in security, I think that to then be told once they're inside that you're going off for military training and that the governor can send you to any British overseas territory, but if he wants to send you to a foreign country, he needs only have the consent of the Premier. That is troubling. I found much support amongst the Caymans that I talked to for a regiment as has been proposed by the Premier and the Governor and the UK government, i.e. one that is available for disaster relief. I think it is acceptable that years ago when we had the prison riot, it would have been good to have had a regiment to assist the police. I also agree that in the most recent COVID-19 exercises that the police were oftentimes stretched for the lockdown and would have been good. But we don't need military training for any of those. And the question arises, in my mind at least, and in many of the people I talk to, when you say they're going to assist the police, are they going to be under the command of the police? Or they're going to be under their own commanding officer? And how is that going to jive together to be successful? As I said, Mr. Speaker, I support a regiment that provides humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and Coast Guard when called upon to do so by the Governor. What I do not support in this bill is that this regiment is going to be charged with the defense of the islands and such other duties as the Governor may determine. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, one of my big concerns in the construct of this bill is that it does not seem like the focus has been disaster preparedness, assistance, and humanitarian relief. Because nowhere have I seen any opportunity provided for these volunteers to attend such institutions as the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, or other areas where they can get the kind of training in disaster relief that they need. Now, Mr. Speaker, if I could do my usual and deal with the actual clauses in the bill. And while I have not yet tabled specific amendments to the bill, that is in process. But I was hoping I got it done on the weekend, but I was down with the flu that the Premier gave me on Friday over the weekend. And so I wasn't able to do it. But I'll go through the bill, and hopefully before the House breaks up today, I can get, no, I'm just ribbing the Premier. I know how I got the flu from my 5-year-old daughter who brought it home from school. But my first concern is Clause 3, which says military service to be performed in and outside of the islands. It says a member of the regiment may be required to perform military services, include training and non-combatant services, both in and outside of the islands, at the direction of the governor. And one of the things that bothers me about the construct of this bill is the authority given to the governor. That it is, some of the things there are far too colonial for Ezra Miller. In Clause 5, it says duties of the regiment. The regiment is responsible for A, defense of the islands. One of the amendments I'd like to see is for A to be deleted. B, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I approach that. I support that. Assisting the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service and the Coast Guard when called upon to so by the governor. I think we need to fix something in that sentence because it doesn't make sense the way it reads. But I support C. Such other duties as the governor determines, I'd like to see that deleted as well. Governor acts in the governor's discretion. Clause 7. In exercise of the governor's powers and duties under this law and any other enactment relating to matters of defense, including armed forces, the governor shall act in the governor's discretion. I would like to see something, at least certain sections of the bill, carry the requirement for him to at least consult with the National Security Council before he makes some of these decisions about Caymanians in this regiment. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the curious things in this bill is it sets up a defense board and a defense medical officer. But the board does not do a lot. Everything is done by the governor in his discretion. There are lots of things in here, such as discipline, promotion, discharge, that is done by the governor's discretion, that I believe should be done by the board. Because if you're going to set up a board, what's the point of having a board if it doesn't do anything? And 5 of 9 really perturbs me. And again, I don't know why the discretion is so wide in 9.1. The governor shall by notice appoint annually a board called the Defense Board, which shall consist of such number of persons, being not less than 5 and not more than 11. That's a wide scope. I mean, if we write in legislation, let's be specific. A board of 5 people should be enough. I mean, he'll have the freedom here to add people on just to get what he wants done. And then it says, a person appointed to the board shall hold office during the governor's pleasure, and unless the person's appointment is earlier terminated, it shall be deemed to terminate 1 year from the date upon which the appointment took effect. Again, why are we so limited? Normally, when we appoint boards in government, they are either at the discretion of cabinet or the discretion of the governor, and members can be reappointed. This doesn't seem like it allows people to be reappointed. It seems like they have to be terminated 1 year upon which the appointment took effect. And if this board is going to be made up of Caymanians, we could run to the people's own to put on the board, but not many of us left. Then it says, then it says there shall be a chairperson and a deputy chairperson of the board, each of whom shall be appointed by the governor from among the members of the board, and each of whom shall hold office as such during the governor's pleasure. Again, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see, before the governor appoints this board, that the members are run by the National Security Council. We seem to be diminishing all the time the role and function of the National Security Council. Is that because the Premier was successful in negotiating in the constitutional changes that he must accept the advice of the Council? Because Caymanians need to be given the opportunity to be much more involved than we currently are in the security of our country. And this seems to be more and more taking it away. Then it says, notwithstanding subsections 1 to 3, the board shall be deemed to be properly constituted even though there is a vacancy in the board, in the office of chairperson or deputy chairperson or any other member of the board. But this is the troubling one. 9.5. At any meeting of the board, the governor may preside over the meeting if, acting at the governor's discretion, the governor decides to do so, but unless the governor so decides, the meeting shall be preserved over by the chairperson. So the governor is going to appoint a board, he's going to appoint a chairperson and a deputy chairperson. But he can walk into any meeting and say, I'm chairing this meeting, and take it over. Now that reeks of colonialism that's maximum. If he's not satisfied with what the chairman and the deputy chairman is doing, he should change them. But if he wants to achieve something particular from this board, he can just walk into the room, chairman is expected to conduct a meeting, has tabled his agenda, and says, sorry, gentlemen and ladies, I'm going to chair this meeting. That could never be right. I can't support, those are the kind of things in this bill that I will not support. And as bad as I would like to see a regiment for those two purposes, I will vote against the bill in the third reading if I can't get things like that changed in committee stage. Governor may consult board. An exercise of his powers and duties, the governor under this law and any other enactment which relates to matters of defense, the governor may consult with or take advice of the board as the governor thinks fit. But notwithstanding that the governor has consulted or taken the advice of the board on any matter, the governor may act in the governor's discretion on such matters. Again, he can just ignore the board, advice of the board. And I would like to see a caveat put on that only after consulting with the National Security Council should he be allowed to ignore or override the advice he got from the board. Because unless we expect this board to be active and to do things in the interest of Cayman and Caymanians, then don't appoint a board, just leave it in his office. Because that's what my professor used to talk about, wings flapping and no birds flying. He put the wings out there to flap, but he don't intend for them to get off the ground. And I would, in 2, it says, in exercise of the governor's delegated responsibilities for regiment matters, the minister and the deputy governor may consult the board. I think that should be shall. Consult the board. Well, who knows? Because everything else talks about the premier in the bill. So this is, I guess, it depends on, he wants the ability to blame any minister that he sees fit, because it's not defined. Command of the regiment. Subject, and 2, I quote, subject to this law, let me start with 1. The governor shall appoint an officer known as the commanding officer, who is a member of the regiment, in whom the command of the regiment will be vested. And that officer is responsible for the control and administration of the regiment, subject to the governor's discretion and to the provisions of this law. The governor's discretion should never override the provisions of the law, but that indicates that he can do it. Then goes on in 2 to say, subject to this law and the governor's orders, the commanding officer may A, make standing orders for the control, administration, and general government of the regiment, and B, issue a handbook, a code of practice, or such other guidelines as the commanding officer may see fit for the guidance, government, and regulation of members of the regiment. I would like to see a C added to that clause that says all such standing orders and handbook shall be approved by the board. Because again, if we have a board, let's give it something to do. Let's give it some teeth. It doesn't seem like this handbook has to be approved by anybody except the commanding officer currently. Governor's orders, 13.1. Subject to this law, the governor may make general or special orders to be called governor's orders with respect to the administration, recruitment, organization, government, training, pay, and allowances of the regiment, and with respect to any matter and thing related to the regiment, including any matter, A, which is expressed by this law to be a matter for which provisions may be made by governor's orders, and B, which under this law may be or is to be prescribed by governor's orders. Again, I would like to see him have to consult the National Security Council before issuing those orders. Two, without prejudice to the generality of the powers conferred upon the governor by subsection 1, provision may be made by governor's orders for the following: members of the regiment in whom command over any part of the regiment or members thereof is vested, and as to the circumstances in which such command is to be exercised. B, the formation of members of the regiment into subunits. C, for posting, attaching, or otherwise dealing with such members within the regiment. D, for attracting members of the regiment for service with a cadet corps established in the islands or by or under any law. E, for the constitution of a permanent staff including officers, adjutants, warrant officers, and non-commissioned officers who may be members of the regiment or Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Why do we need Her Majesty's Armed Forces to come in here and run this regiment? Because, Mr. Speaker, you and I both know that once they get you, they're not leaving. They're not leaving. They will find reasons. We were promised here 5 years ago, one recruit was going to be here 2 years, still here. Fire chief was coming for X months, X years, still here. If you bring in members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces to run this operation, that is going to be the criteria, and any Caymanian who wish to get up to the level of running the operation will have to join UK Arm and be a member of her forces. Because anytime you put these little pieces of paper that Caymanians need, it's only one more piece of paper, one more step we have to do in order to get in a position. So I would like to see Her Majesty's Armed Forces deleted, and it come from within the regiment. If we're going to recruit Caymanians into this regiment in its infancy, Caymanians who volunteer, who have a desire to do this, who can be trained to move up, then why do we need these other people? I agree with the Premier's statement that it is better to have people assisting us in disaster preparedness who know the lay of the land and who know the people and who might know how many people are in that house that got blown away. And you know, we see all these ads in the paper, Mr. Speaker, about we recruiting Caymanians. I know of one instance where an employee of a local company went to do some work at the governor's house. When they got in a conversation about what the person's background was, the person was hired instantly, even though the Caymanian company still has a workman for the person, no? But he's employed full-time, as I understand it, by the regiment. Now I want to know how that could happen. You would think at a very minimum, his work permit would get cancelled for the private firm. And Mr. Speaker, the only reason I'm not calling names is because you and I both know what would happen to the company when they went back and get another work permit. But I can assure you it is real and that it happened. I probably now understand why in 14 it says, subject to directions of the governor, and subject 15, a person who is 18 years of age or no more than 50 years of age, and who is, this is very, very, very interesting, a Commonwealth or Irish citizen. The question is, why do we need an Irish citizen? Could perchance the person I just spoke about happens to be Irish? Now, Mr. Speaker, again, I don't see why we need 14 at all. Why do we need Commonwealth and Irish citizens, British overseas territorial citizens, or a British citizen? We should be recruiting our own and developing them. Under Governor's Commission and the appointment and transfer of officers, the Governor may, in the Governor's discretion, by commission, appoint a person who is eligible to enlist in accordance with Section 14 to a rank of officer listed in Schedule 1 in the regiment where that person fulfills the prescribed conditions as to age, physical fitness, education, qualifications, or other conditions as the Governor may determine. Those are the kind of things that I think need to be done by the board. And educational qualifications and conditions should not be determined after the fact. That should be part of what the board approves prior to recruitment, so that Caymanians will know what the competencies are that are required for this regiment. Again, on 16, relinquishment of commission. An officer may at any time apply in a prescribed form to the governor for permission to relinquish the officer's commission, and the governor, after considering the circumstances, may grant the application, subject to subsection 3, if the governor is satisfied that A, an officer is inefficient, an officer has been guilty or neglect of duty or misconduct, or C, any other cause an officer should no longer be an officer. The governor may, by notice in writing, under the governor's hand, require that the officer relinquish the officer's commission, or may, by notice to the officer, dismiss the officer. Again, all the things in this section, Mr. Speaker, I think should be the purview of the board, with clearly established criteria. Because the governor cannot do it, because this is a full-time job. The amount of interaction and the jobs that he has to perform for this regiment could occupy most of his day. Under Part 5, exempted services, subject to subsection 3, where a member of the regiment is employed both by the regiment and by an exempted service, the member's employment obligations to the exempted service take priority over the member's employment obligations to the regiment. For the purposes of Section 1, an exempted service means Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Fire and Rescue Services B, C, the Police Service, D, the Prison Service, E, the Coast Guard. G, service as an emergency medical technician or paramedic for a hospital, or a person in holy orders or a minister in a religion, denomination recognized by the governor as such for the purposes of this law. So the governor recognized religions we have in Cayman now too. I don't see the need for A, Mr. Speaker. Because we're saying we go and recruit UK armed forces to come here and be the bosses in this thing, set it up. But if the UK armed services call them 3 days after they get here, they have priority, they go back. So what's the point of bringing them in the first place? I think these are the kind of decisions that need to be made by the board. And this should be part of that handbook that is approved by the board. There's no reference in none of this disciplinary procedure that refers to this handbook of code of conduct. This all seems to be in the governor's discretion. And that's an administrative nightmare. Because people need to know, the recruits need to know what standards they have to perform to, what are the conditions, what are the things they can't do, what gets them in trouble in disciplinary procedures, what the punishment is for those breaking of those disciplinary procedures. But there's no reference in any of this back to that handbook. We may say that that's an expectation of the governor. But you know, we had governors and we had governors. Chalk and cheese. And again, the under Part 6, obligation to undergo military training, but there's no obligation to undergo any disaster preparedness training. That needs to be in the bill. Because that is what all of us hope is going to be their primary role. You don't need to be a trained military officer in order to assist the police with crowd control. We have been relying on that elite force called special constables, which is you can get into Harvard easily and get into that, even though you're volunteering. I would hope that we can get an amendment to this that says these people have to get some recognized international disaster and disaster preparedness and rescue training from one of the institutional, internationally established standards. And Mr. Speaker, under Section 25, a member of the regiment who without reasonable excuse, the proof of which shall be upon the person, fails to complete the annual training which by or under this law the person is required to undergo, or B, to attend a number of drills during any particular period in accordance with the directions of the commanding officer giving under this law, commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine equal to 28 days' pay or to imprisonment for a term of 3 months. If the volunteers, people are volunteering for this, but if they don't complete the training, you can put them in jail for 3 months. I mean, I think it's okay to deduct the pay or the little allowance that they get to the 28 days because they have failed it. But remember when Caymanians applied to join the police force, you know, if they can't run a quarter mile in so many seconds, forget what their education or experience is, they don't get in. Whereas we know that fitness is something that you can teach people, you can train people too. But we fail Caymanians who apply to be police because they're 5, 6, 10 seconds short in running a quarter mile or a mile or whatever the test for fitness is. So we say, you know, if the person here is limited, doesn't complete this course, you can put him in prison. I want to see that deleted. I mean, I would think that being dishonorably discharged should be enough punishment, not going to jail for 3 months. Again, grounds for discharge. All the governor. Every clause is the governor. Where's the board? These are functions that the board should perform. Discharge on cause being shown, again. Governor. No reference to the board. Reference to the governor's orders, but not the handbook or the code of conduct. Embodiment of the regiment. 28. 1. If the governor considers it necessary to do so, A, in the interest of public safety, B, for the defense of the islands, C, to assist with public safety in another British overseas territory or foreign state, or D, for any other reason as the governor sees fit. The governor may, by order published in the Gazette or otherwise made known to members of the regiment in such manner as may seem to the governors best suited to the circumstances, direct that the regiment or any part of the regiment be embodied. Again, Mr. Speaker, I think there should be some reference to the National Security Council before the regiment is embodied. The governor shall consult the Premier before making an order under Section 1 unless the governor considers this impractical. What does that mean? I mean, Cayman is not that big. We usually have weeks advance notice for them, right? You can find a premier for every other reason that you want, right? I can't think in this day and age. I can't think of any situation where the government could consider it impractical or impossible to consult the premier. I mean, it's usually only Saturdays and Sundays he's not having the same building with him, on the same floor, for most of the working time, right? But I think there's more to that than they want us to know. And I'm not one of those who believes in the conspiracy theories. I don't think this is a conspiracy. Three, the governor shall seek the agreement of the premier before embodying the regiment for a deployment to a foreign state, but agreement is not required for deployment within the islands or to another British overseas territory. Again, why do we have to be so pedantic? I can't think of any Caymanian who could be in the position of premier that would not agree to a practical deployment of the regiment. Why do we need to put it in law that he can do it without consulting, but with consulting, but he can do it anyway? And this might be a governor that only come yesterday and do it tomorrow, you know, or come today. There's no time frame. There's no requirement of what kind of experience the government has had here. I don't think, and again, we have a National Security Council. Why is it being deliberately eliminated by this bill? When that is supposed to be the body created in our Constitution to deal with these things. A member of the regiment who, without reasonable excuse, the proof of which shall be upon the person, fails to report as required by this section, commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction of a fine equal to 28 days' pay or to imprisonment for a term of 6 months. So, we have a Caymanian who volunteered to join this regiment. And the governor decides he can send him to Angola and Africa. And the Caymanian said, I'm not going. We put him in jail for 6 months. Do we really want to set that kind of thing in law in this house? I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'd like to see that imprisonment for a term of 6 months deleted. Normally, in regiments, a dishonorable discharge is the ultimate punishment. Or docking their pay for the 28 days pay. Because that could be a situation where the Caymanian premier, not the UK governor, says, I don't agree with sending the regiment to Angola. So the Caymanians say, I ain't going. Put him in jail for 6 months. That don't make a lot of sense. Well, I would assume that this Metro Cabinet and everybody agree with all these things in the bill. That's fine. That's possible. That's possible. Okay. I still don't think punishment should rise to the level of 6 months in jail. Whether I'm misrepresenting it or not. And I don't think that you can get too many Caymanians volunteering for this. If they know they don't show up for work, they go in jail. Penalty on summary conviction. 43. The governor, on receiving a recommendation from the commanding officer that a member of the regiment who is convicted by a summary court should be dishonorably discharged, may so discharge the member, or B, remit the case to the commanding officer, requiring the commanding officer to consider the commanding officer's recommendations. Again, Mr. Speaker, those are functions that I believe belong to the board. And what level of crime is necessary? Any conviction at all before the summary court? Because there's no qualifications here. Under the general Part 10, the general provisions, where a person who is a member of the regiment suffers disablement or is killed as a result of undergoing military training under this law, or B, suffers disablement or is killed as a result of service in the regiment when embodied, that person or the person's dependents shall be eligible for the grant of such pension as the governor may determine after consultation with the minister responsible for finance. Again, Mr. Speaker, that's far too discretionary for me. I would like to see some formula put in there, or in regulations at least, that provides some guidance of what kind of compensation these people would get. Allowance, pay and allowances. Subject to this section, where a member of the regiment is required to attend drills, annual camp, or is embodied, then in respect of the member's attendance, the member shall be paid such remuneration by way of basic pay and allowances as may be fixed by the governor after consultation with the minister responsible for finance. The governor's orders may regulate the payment of additional remuneration in exceptional cases. Again, Mr. Speaker, I believe that should be linked somehow to the government salary scale system in terms of what they're going to get paid. And in 60, subsection 3, a person arresting for committing an offense in accordance with subsection 2 shall be taken by a member of the regiment as soon as possible to a police officer. I think we need to delete one of those, be taken. In concluding, Mr. Speaker, I'm a little concerned at the haste with which this has been put together. We know, or we see that it's going to cost us somewhere around $1.4 million. Now, in this day and age, in the civil service, where everything requires a business case, it's normally, which is established by statute, it's normally all programs in government have to go through these days, procurement, regulations, etc., etc. I mean, I've been waiting 4 years for Dock and Old Man Bay, and 4 years now they're still going through processes, and they're trying to get the design finalized now, and then they have to go through all this procurement process to award the contract and get the material and etc., etc. But this seems to be put together quite quickly with a $1.4 million, and I know my dock here cost that. Mr. Speaker, I will do my usual. I will try to get some changes in committee stage, and I hope to get enough changes to allow me to vote for the bill on the third reading. Thank you, sir.
The member for George West Bay North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, but I'm going to get this on the water, you know.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Northside has touched on quite a few of the same points that I had on my paper, and also members of the public have text, emailed, messaged. And the one little bit of difference from the member from Northside, Mr. Speaker, is that when they said defense, I'm not sure who we have to defend against. But I can leave that alone. But when the Premier said in his preamble that when the Bermuda Regiment came here, and it was something that he and Mr. Tibbetts and all that they started formulating in his mind, Mr. Speaker, and that the first time they took it to England, they turned it down. And then he was able to get it through a second time. But as you look through this bill, I don't know where the Premier disappeared to, because all of a sudden everything is about one man. And therein, Mr. Speaker, lies my problem. Starting with number 3, military service to be performed in and outside of the islands. A member of the regiment may be required to perform military services, including training and non-combatant services, both in and outside the islands, at the direction of the governor. Number 5, where it says the regiment is responsible for the defense of the island, providing humanitarian. D, such other duties as the governor determines. Not that he has to consult with our Premier. Regardless of which side of this floor you stand on, that man in that seat right there is my Premier, he's our Premier. Number 14, subject to direction of the governor, and Section 15, a person who is 18 years of age, no more than 50 years of age, who is. Now, the member from Northside touched this, but this allows the governor to circumvent the immigration law and enlist a person from any country of his choice. Read it carefully. Number 3, the governor may consult the premier, may, not shall, and may, in the governor's discretion, allow persons not meeting the requirements of subsection 1 to be enlisted into the regiment if the governor considers this to be the best interest of the regiment. Mr. Speaker, not the best interest of the Cayman Islands, but the best interest of the regiment. I said most of these, Mr. Miller, went into details. I'm not going to repeat that because other people want to speak. 28D, for any other reason as the governor sees fit. And then last but not least, if this is not what they say it is, it's so funny that on page 42 it says it starts with military offenses. Mr. Speaker, I say this. There's a saying, the sun never set, it used to say, the sun never set on the British Empire. But a lot of people never finish that sentence, and it says, because God don't trust an Englishman in the dark. Mr. Speaker, and this present set, this country on a lot of people don't trust. They're feeling very uncomfortable with everything that's being forced down our throats and been doing so rapidly. The haste, Mr. Speaker, with which these things are coming through, that members can find all these things to show where there's mistakes. People losing their homes, and we won't rush to do anything to help them. But we're rushing for this. The Premier was right when he talked about, during the pandemic, when we saw our border police, immigration, customs, everybody working together on the street. But the Cayman Islands people, we behave. Mr. Speaker, but what makes me laugh is when they flew in people to tell us about hurricane. And when during Hurricane Ivan, those who were supposed to help us didn't help us. I saw a boat out in the harbor for about 24 hours. She disappeared. Went Grenada was the last place I heard she was going to. But they weren't here with us. It was us Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, I too, along with agree with the member from Northside. Like I said, this is not going to be long because he covered it pretty much in detail. And there's a lot of things in here that is simple. Take out the governor, put in the National Security Council. I don't want my young people in the hands of an Englishman. Plain and simple. Put it in the hands of the National Security Council, who has Caymanians sitting there that will know how to look out for our own. And when you look at jail time for volunteer, Mr. Speaker, something's not right. I too, like the member of Northside, want to support something like this, but in this present form, I will not be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I will break for lunch at 12:45. 10 more minutes to go. The Honorable the Leader of the Opposition, thinking you will complete your speech in that time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hear these young people nowadays saying, you got game, you're funny. Mr. Speaker, thank you, sir. I rise to make a contribution to the bill before us, the defense bill. And in so doing, I hope to bring some degree of clarity as to my position on defense of this country. Mr. Speaker, I believe I should start by briefly going over one of the areas that the Premier did in his presentation, in order that people will understand my position with regard to defense. Mr. Speaker, we have forever been the very vulnerable three islands in the Caribbean when it comes to that. Mr. Speaker, we have heard over the years, and more so in recent times, are people speaking of having a dialogue on independence and dictating our own destiny. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we are going to go down that road to start discussing that, there are certain aspects of that require us to prepare for. I believe the Premier said once that independence is as inevitable as death. At some stage, it's going to happen. I don't know how soon. I hear people talking about having part of it being having offices throughout the world. That's only a small aspect of dictating one's own destiny and being a part of the independent world. I believe also part of it is provisions to defend our country at some stage, regardless of what that is or how many we think is required. I note that a similar sized country in population, St. Kitts and Nevis, they too are independent, and they have their own little army, regardless of what it is. Mr. Speaker, so in that regard, I have, over my entire political career, sought, defended the creation of defense mechanisms in this country. The Premier spoke of 2005 to 2009 administration when we wanted to create a regiment. I was part of advocating therefore. Well, agreed. I believe it was, the subject was broached long before that, but I am speaking of my experiences in cabinet. Mr. Speaker, I fought for the proper resourcing of the police force, because at the time, since my involvement in politics, the beginning of my involvement in politics, I've always said that the only means of defense we have in this country is the police force, be that what it may. Mr. Speaker, indeed, when the Premier and I could not get across, what's that former governor name? The little short one? Stuart Jack. Yes. I was the one who went ahead and painted up the police stations. I personally took an interest in that, a physical interest in it. I went to every police station. Indeed, it was I who upgraded the police stations with the support also of the Premier and the other members of Cabinet. My good friend from Savannah and the then elected member from Town, Clifford, Minister Clifford, and the leader of government business, Kurt Tibbetts. They all supported me in doing that. I went even further, Mr. Speaker, and they, with their support, I introduced a motion to the Cabinet for us to create our own Coast Guard, which would include helicopters. I was vilified by the public. Some days I didn't want to go into office because of the criticism. But I soldiered on. We eventually, under Stuart Jack, brought that name to be the Marine Unit of the Police Department. We got the boats. We procured the helicopter. Mr. Speaker, I can't say that we did a good job there because I gotta get to him. You don't worry, everybody gotta get their little piece here today. Mr. Speaker, I said we did no good job, and the Premier corrected me by saying it was not our responsibility. We relied on the then Commissioner of Police to secure the helicopter. Maybe we were at fault for allowing that to happen. We should have engaged a company to go and seek out a helicopter. Nevertheless, subsequently, we were assured that that was the model helicopter we needed. However, the helicopter was not properly surveyed, and we ran into much difficulty with it. Thankfully, the administration that came subsequently got it out of New Orleans, where we found all the problems with it, with the rotor being broken and whatnot. But indeed, Mr. Speaker, that just says to this country that I have always defended the creation of a defense, the start of us becoming part of our own, if I may say. Mr. Speaker, in the 80s, Roy Bodden and Gilbert McLean, both former members of this parliament, brought a motion here for the creation of the Cadet Corps. I supported it then, and ever since becoming a member, it might have been the 90s, Mr. Speaker. I believe it might have been the 90s because I came here in 2000. Since coming here as a member of Parliament, of the Legislative Assembly, I have to be careful how I say that nowadays. Mr. Speaker, I have challenged every government to resource the Cadet Corps better, because I believe that the Cadet Corps could have been expanded where the police department would be the beneficiaries of those coming out of there, with those coming out of there joining the police department, thus getting good young Caymanians to join the police department, just like Clifford did when he was still in diapers. Practical. I think he became a cadet in the police force around 16 or something like that, and rose very fast. And I hope he doesn't think that I'm being disrespectful when I say diapers. Mr. Speaker, I have sat here, stood here, and asked governments, and when I was there, I did everything to try to advance that Cadet Corps. I've sat here, I've stood here, to the point that I've asked every government to resource the Cadet Corps much better. We have done a lot, but I believe we could do more. I have even said to them, governments, that government has a lot of unused land, unclaimed land that has now turned to crown within my constituency, and I believe we should let them establish themselves on a piece of that land, and people will donate and government can contribute and they build their own compound. So, Mr. Speaker, just about a year ago, the now government now called me or contacted me and said that the Minister for the Armed Services, I believe they call it Armed Forces, of the UK, Lancaster, was here. But the papers had already announced the reasons for his visit. And he asked if I could meet with him. But the only space he had available was the evening before the cocktail party at the governor's house, and I could have 4 to 5 minutes with him. So I gladly accepted the invitation, and I went to the governor's house to meet with this Lancaster. We met in the foyer, the reception, the lounge foyer. And the governor, in the presence of the governor and 2 of his aides, I sat down to discuss this matter with MP Lancaster. Mr. Speaker, my first thing to him was, let's park these civil servants, the 3 of them. Let's conduct this meeting as if they're not here. We are one politician talking to the other. you have to go into your constituency and convince your people that what you're going to propose is good. I have to do likewise. Mr. Speaker, he said to me all of the reasons and the purposes of this regiment that England was proposing. And my response to him was, I have always supported a regiment, but there are some conditions I have that I will not compromise on. Number one, this regiment will not be used in the form of conscription to the United Kingdom Army.
Honourable Member, we reached that time. We will take the lunch suspension until 2:15. The House will be suspended until 2:15.